Well, we want to welcome everyone today to our next in our monthly series of talks on diversity and racism and race-related topics. We are so grateful that you have joined us today. We had a great discussion last month. I know we will today as well, and we are in the planning phases for our discussion in November as well. I hope that as you are having conversations with colleagues, friends, family, that you too are talking about these issues amongst your colleagues and friends and family. That in our leadership meeting this morning, we had our weekly discussion, and a comment was made that it's the younger generations, the college students that we are teaching, some of us, that this is going to be the generation that is really going to make things happen and move things forward. And as we continue these conversations, then we will make sure that progress is made now. Our speaker today, or our presenter today, is Leonelle Thompson. She is the Assistant Dean and Director of the Business Career Center in the Collins College of Business here at the University of Tulsa. She is a third generation TU graduate. Her mother and grandmother are also TU grads. She has a BSBA degree in 2004, and in 2005 received an MBA, and worked in industry for several years before coming back to TU. And she has also taught a couple of classes in the College of Business. She is certified by the Exceptional Leaders Lab in Temperament, Fluency, and Diversity and Equity and Inclusion Training, and is a member of Mosaic. It is the Tulsa Regional Chamber's Diversity Business Council. She is involved on the TU campus as the Vice Chair of the TU Staff Advisory Council and chairs the Diversity and Inclusion Committee for the Southern Association of Colleges and Employees. She has done some presentations to the President's Leadership Team at TU, which includes the vice presidents and deans, and I've enjoyed her presentations there and the things that she's been able to share. And so when we were thinking about our discussion for this month, it made sense that we would reach out to her. So Leonelle, I'm going to turn the time over to you, and we look forward to your presentation. And as Leonelle is speaking, if you have questions or comments, you can include those in the chat, and we will get to those when her presentation is concluded. So with that, Leonelle, I'm going to turn the time over to you.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to just transition here and share screen. Get that going. All right, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. Thank you, Dean Ploger, for having this series, these talks. It's very important, I think, now more so than ever. So I just want to build on that. I want to lead this conversation today and discuss how did we get here, and talk about our history and its impact on our behaviors. So you'll see on the title slide there quite a few different graphics from slavery to the most recent with I Can't Breathe. But I just wanted to go through this today, and I welcome your questions, your comments, and we just want to have a discussion. And so I'll offer up definitely my opinion on many things, but also just trying to connect the dots from questions that I hear and the work that I do, not only here at the University of Tulsa, but with other clients, as we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and more importantly, racism and race, and how all of that plays together. So let's talk. So what are we going to talk about? I'm going to define racism. I'm going to give a little bit of history, and I'm going to begin, I put on the slide with the 13th Amendment. I'm going to go a little bit back and talk about the Constitution. So this is definitely from a United States perspective. I'm going to talk about who we are. We're going to explore our social identities and how that plays into how that was defined, how those are defined based on our history, and how those play into some of the behaviors that we have. We're going to talk about those behaviors of unconscious bias and microaggressions, really wanting to put a name with behaviors we've either experienced, behaviors we may have actually acted on or acted out. I want to attach a name to them and explain those terms. And then lastly, I always like to leave with an action plan. You know, in this work, it's going to take all of us. And so the education piece is what we're doing now, but then what do we do with that? Where does the action come from? And so definitely I welcome your comments, your chats throughout. And then we'll get to those towards the end, but I definitely want to leave time for those questions and answers as we go through. So defining racism. One of the things that I hear a lot of, I was talking to a colleague of mine, and she asked, how do they become racist? What does racism mean? You know, why is it so hard to talk about? I firmly believe it is so hard to talk about is because we can't agree on a definition of racism. And so in 1977, David Wellman, in his book Portraits, or it was a white paper, Portraits of White Racism, offered up this definition: a system of advantage based on race. If you look in the dictionary, Webster's dictionary, a lot of times race or racism is equated with prejudice. And that's really hard for people to get their arms around, because we all have prejudices. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're all racist. With his definition of a system of advantage based on race, it really expands that and removes that just singular explanation of just prejudice, but really looks at the systems, looks at our policies, looks at our laws, looks at how we behave to encompass the actual definition of racism. And all of that being based upon race. Beverly Tatum said it best when we talk about systemic or institutional racism. It's those wide-ranging policies, those norms in place that create the system of disadvantage based on someone's race. So it's not just enough to have prejudice to be racist or have racism. It's the wide-ranging policies, and it's when that prejudice against someone's race exists, and those prejudice views are then reinforced by systems of power. That's how we get to institutional or systemic racism. One of the examples I always like to use is when we think of little boys, and we think of our little Black boys and grades as early as pre-K. And there's a prejudice, there's a preconceived notion that they are unruly, that they are a little aggressive in their play, which may otherwise be characterized as just normal childhood behavior. So a teacher thinking that alone wouldn't necessarily be a system of advantage based on race. But when those little Black boys and those students are then punished, and those prejudice views are then reinforced, so they suffer higher expulsion rates, they are disciplined a little harsher than some of the other races in the class. That's institutional and systemic racism. Those prejudice views against someone's race are reinforced by the systems of power. And so when we do this kind of work, when we talk about, later on I'll talk about non-racist versus anti-racist, when we discuss that, it's not enough just not to participate in those racist views. You have to actually work harder to dismantle the systemic racist views, because they are so deeply embedded in our American society. So how did we get there? Let's take a look at our history. So these are the practices, the policies and laws that have been in place forever, dating back even to the Constitution. If you were to take a literal reading of the Constitution, you would see a phrase that we've all learned in history, 3/5 compromise, which is valuing a Black person at that point in time, a slave, as 3/5 of an individual. And so if we think about that right then and there, we have this notion or this message is you are not equal, you are less than. So let's fast forward to the Civil War. We have the 13th Amendment and the abolishment of slavery. We all know the Civil War was fought for many, many reasons. A lot of the reasons were economic. So once the abolishment of slavery happened, we no longer had, as a country, free labor. So that wrecked the economy. So how do you get that? How do you get that back? How do you get that free labor back to help the economy? Well, slavery had been abolished, but there's a small clause in the 13th Amendment that says except for crimes, and I am paraphrasing that. So it is illegal to have slaves, again, a paraphrase, except for when crimes are committed. It was with the passage of the 13th Amendment that we started to see incarceration, imprisonment of former slaves for petty crimes such as loitering on a street corner, for maybe just even walking down the street, because states decided to start putting in laws that would allow Blacks, former slaves, to be arrested. And then at that point, once you're arrested, you're in prison, and now you're performing the labor that you used to do as a slave. A lot of times the 13th Amendment is overlooked for the role it plays in that. If you have not seen the documentary 13th, it came out in 2016. It's on Netflix. A great documentary that takes a look at the 13th Amendment and goes through to present day being 2016 when it was made, of the mass incarceration system in the United States. So then we have the 14th Amendment, which discusses citizenship. So keep in mind that the 13th Amendment was passed in 1865. The 14th Amendment wasn't passed until 1868. And that extended liberties to former slaves, the liberties we all know, the Bill of Rights. So for 3 years, that notion of you are not equal, you are less than, was still being enforced because former slaves did not have those rights. And then part of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are collectively sometimes called as the Amendments of Reconstruction. The 15th Amendment, which established voting. So you could not be denied voting based on your race. Now, remember, these are constitutional amendments. The states still had the right, and local governments still had rights to impose any kind of poll tax or any kind of voter suppression they wanted to for Black people, or any minority really, when it came to voting. So then we have Jim Crow. So Jim Crow are the laws that enforce racial segregation that were upheld in 1896 with the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which actually stated separate was equal. If you think to the 1950s, we know we have Brown versus Board of Education, which says separate is not actually equal. But Plessy versus Ferguson established you could have different rail cars for white citizens and Black citizens, and that was okay. They didn't have to be the same amenities, you could have them. So this whole time, this message is being reinforced. And so I told my colleague when she asked me, like, well, how do people become racist? Are they born that way? We have to take a look at our history and look at how it was established in the United States of this notion from the very beginning that you are not equal, you are less than. So how does that actually play out? What does that do? How does that relate to our behaviors? How does that play out how we interact with each other? And how does that relate to present day 2020? I want us to take a look at social identities. Social identities, much of our inequities are driven by these long established structures that exist that are tied to social identities. So thinking back to our history, thinking back to our amendments, thinking back to, even not that long ago, we have social identities. These are those labels that we use to categorize or identify ourselves or others as members of specific groups. Now these, if you are looking at the slide, I listed a few. So we have our generation we belong to, our ethnicity, our race, religion, sexual orientation, political affiliation, our profession, socioeconomic statuses. These are all the same things that we use to describe our diversity, whether visible or not visible. These are also the labels that are used to categorize us and identify ourselves or others. They influence our values and the stories we tell about ourselves and the things that motivate us toward action. With social identities, and as we move forward and look through racial inequities and racial injustice, looking at it through a social identity lens will definitely start to open your eyes on what's been attached to certain groups and why. They're very, very powerful, and a lot of times they are shaped by society. When we take a look at what a social identity is, some of these things we cannot change. We cannot change our race. We can't change our ethnicity. So they are dynamic in that they sometimes can be changed and a circumstance can change them, but at other times they are dynamic because they remain with us. Again, they're shaped by society. Some of the notions that we have regarding race or even gender are things that are shaped by society, shaped by the norms, shaped by the systemic racism that exists because they're so deeply embedded. We also have to remember social identities means we can have multiple identities. And that combination matters because the combination of those social identities known as intersectionality can actually explain a lot about a person, the oppression they may suffer from or have suffered from, and the way that our behaviors impact that and the things that we say, the opportunities that are afforded to them, the opportunities that are not afforded to them. So we have to start taking a look at people and with all the multiple identities and how they're all combined. And they can be more or less prominent depending on your particular situation. So this could be if you are a student, your social identity may be at the time, you're a college student, if you're no longer in college, that social identity may not be there or may not necessarily exist anymore. Oftentimes, social identity is the root of unequal power and privilege in this country. We must understand those nuances and helping to see and learning to see each other. And if I go back a slide, looking at us, looking at everyone through the social identity lens will help us to identify some of the behaviors that have really been passed down or that we have learned or that are so ingrained in us because of our history. If we start to look through the social identity lens, we can start to see the nuances and then really start to have that empathy of, wait a second, this isn't right. And we can start to disrupt some of the behaviors or some of the things that we may even see as passive or complacent to start to break down the barriers and the big elephant in the room of systemic racism. So let's take a look at some of the behaviors. So as I said before, social identities are usually the root or are usually the reasons for the various behaviors that we have. And so I want to assign a name to these behaviors. I did a similar presentation not too long ago to a class here at the University of Tulsa. And after I got done, I talked about unconscious bias and microaggressions. And the thing that stuck with me the most with students was that they said, we actually now have a name for what we've been experiencing. And so I want you to take that away too, not only what the name of the behavior is, but how does it all work and what is it and why is it there? So first off, we're going to talk about unconscious bias, also called implicit bias. I'm going to call it either or throughout the presentation. But these are our set of attitudes towards and stereotypes of other social groups that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in ways that we are unaware of, especially negatively. These are, we don't even know that we have these thoughts. We don't even know that we have these attitudes. That's what makes them so dangerous because we are unaware of them. And we all have biases. And in a lot of instances, biases are good. Our brain does not have time to process every single thing that happens. But when you start having the negative impact and the negative attitudes that relate stereotypes about people, and they tend to work against groups that have been victims of overt racism, that's where unconscious bias becomes extremely dangerous. So how does it work? So what happens is, as I've said before, our brain can only take in so much. We have so much thrown at us, so much we have to absorb in our brain. Our brain can only take in so much and process so much. So a lot of times what we do is we're on autopilot. When we get up in the morning, we don't have to think through, okay, I need to get dressed because if I don't get dressed and I go outside without being dressed, that's a violation. I'll probably get arrested. We don't have to think through that. Our brain knows you have to put on clothes. So our brain is trying to process everything, but we have an event that happens. And this event can be something that you actually experienced. It could be something that you vicariously experienced, so a story told to you, something passed down through the generations, thinking back to our history, a viewpoint, again, thinking back to the overarching message that was so prominent in our country of You are not equal. You are not the same. You are second class. So something in your mind has triggered. And so this event has happened, and you retain that event, you retain that information. And as you retain it, that is what your mind goes through, much like getting dressed. It doesn't think about anything else. It's, I see this particular person, this is what I'm going to think. And when you do that, then those stereotypes that you've been taught or that you've experienced, they come into play, which leads to your behavior, which leads to very biased outcomes and actions. And so the whole time, nothing new has been entered into your brain. The brain only refers to what has been entered. So if there's nothing to challenge that stereotype, nothing to challenge that little voice, then you will continue to have on autopilot this unconscious thought towards a group of people based on an event that happened. So how do we get past that? You have to disrupt it. You have to intentionally disrupt that assumption and that retention of whatever that event is to make sure that you have a balanced outcome. So what are some examples of an unconscious bias? We see this in hiring, not moving a candidate forward in the hiring process based on the name that's on the resume. We have a preconceived notion, or we have a bias of a name, and we associate a certain type of behavior with that name. And the behavior is, we're not going to move that candidate forward. Searching to find certain attributes in a person based on a perception. This is known as perception bias, and then being astonished or confused when the attributes are not found. So purposely seeking out something to confirm, it's also called confirmation bias, to confirm a preconceived notion you had. Instead of just really getting to know the person, you're constantly seeking out a perception. An example of this would be you have maybe the notion that all Black people are lazy. So you constantly look for that moment when that employee is maybe sitting down on the job or being lazy, because you want to reinforce that based on or confirm it based on a perception. Only watching news channels or social media outlets that reinforce your views. So again, not entering anything new into the brain to upset some of the biases we have. And as I said when I began the presentation, teachers labeling Black boys as aggressive for what would otherwise be deemed regular or childlike behavior. Having that unconscious bias of a bias towards little Black boys that if they knock over blocks in the classroom, and I use that because of how young it starts. You think about a pre-K-er at 4 years old, just being a little boy, knocking over blocks, but he could easily be labeled because of a bias as aggressive, and could set him on a course for the rest of his career, the rest of his life, as being aggressive for something that would otherwise be seen as childlike behavior. I take that back to our history. I take it back to the loophole, so to speak, in the 13th Amendment, where Blacks could just be arrested for standing on the street. I shared this with a colleague of, I think that's part of the reason sometimes people are scared when there's a group of Black people standing on the street corner. It goes back, and again, it's unconscious. We don't know. People don't know why they're scared, but it goes back to that was seen as a criminal act because of the loophole in the 13th Amendment. So, you know, we've been taught that Black boys are aggressive for behavior that we don't associate with any other race. And so we have to definitely make sure that we disrupt these biases, because as we'll see in a second, those biases lead to another type of behavior that acts out. And the whole time we're experiencing these biases and we are, again, not aware of them, and we are acting on them, we are continuing to perpetuate the systemic racism that exists. So how do we stop it? You have to be intentional. You have to interrupt the bias. You have to introduce new things to your brain. I think this was a big wake-up call for the whole country, and for the world for that matter, this summer, while we were all at home, where before we had seen on TV Black men being killed, but to watch George Floyd with a knee on his neck as he took his last breath, that introduced a lot of new things to a lot of brains to interrupt the bias. You have to educate yourself. Being on a call like this today, helps you to educate yourself, assign a name to things, know what some of the biases are. I will say unconscious bias could be a whole week-long training, but introducing those new things, educating yourself, you have to be intentional about it, because again, unconscious bias, it's unconscious. You're not even aware that your mind's thinking it. Start to question things. People started to question the killing of George Floyd. They started to question, why was this okay? They woke up and said, wait a second, this isn't right. That's what we have to continue to do to interrupt the biases. Again, education, having those conversations, and then call it out. You've got to stop that little voice in your head that says, you know, this is true, so don't try to stop me. This is what you've been taught. This is what we know to be true. Call it out. Say, wait a second, no. And also call it out to others. If you see the bias going forward, if you're on a hiring committee, question, why aren't these candidates moved forward? Make them say it. Make them be aware of that bias. If it's not because of qualifications, then keep asking the questions. Why didn't you move this candidate forward? What's in our policy that would be unfair or discriminatory against a certain group of people? A lot of times in HR policies, they are written in a way that does not allow natural hair to be worn. That's a bias that at the time written maybe didn't necessarily mean or have intentional effects on African American or Black women, but it does. So being willing to call it out to yourself and also to others, which takes a lot of courage, but that's the only way we start to dismantle this and change the behaviors, not only in ourselves, but also in others. And so as we go forward, I want you to think about other examples of unconscious bias. Again, the brain can only do so much. Research has been done on many unconscious biases and the types of biases and our cognitive abilities. And there's so many research ones. And just the thing to take away is that we're unaware of them. And that's why we have to continue to introduce new things to our brain. These behaviors that I've mentioned may not by themselves be deemed racist, right? But they do aid in perpetuating the systemic racism. They aid in that confirmation or the continuation of, okay, we're not gonna move this candidate forward. And so that starts to impact possibly diversity. That starts to impact equity. That definitely starts to impact inclusion. And so you can see how something that we may not even be aware of and our behavior could have long-lasting effects on a system that we are trying so desperately to undo. So I want to talk about microaggressions now. So microaggressions originate usually from an unconscious bias. So the unconscious bias, think of it as that's in your head, that's something you're not aware of that you've thought, but you know, it may be something that you may not ever actually act out. The microaggression is what the action is. That's usually going to be verbal or some sort of action. This term originated in the 1970s, and it originated as an explanation to explain the experiences that Black Americans were having that caused physical and psychological pain. And the thing about these experiences that were happening in the 1970s, so taking you back to the 1970s, what had just happened in our American society was the passage of the Civil Rights Act, right? So this is post-Civil Rights Act. This is 1970s. The experiences that Black people were having were not the same as the pre-Civil Rights experiences and the pre-Civil Rights forms of discrimination. You know, as we think about what happened during the Civil Rights movement of sit-ins and the physical removement from counters, the physical just beatings that took place and bombings and dogs and fire hoses, this pain was different. This was psychological and physical in nature, but it wasn't the same. And so what the research showed was that these were starting to be these brief, commonplace inequities that were communicating hostility and negative effects, negative slights. They were a comment or action that is usually unconscious or intentional and subtle. And we say they are unconscious because rarely does, I hope rarely, does someone get up in the morning and say, I'm going to go find a small way to hurt a person today. So again, this is why we say unconscious biases lead to these microaggressions, because it's our thought process that we have in our mind, these thoughts that we've been introduced to, that we're retaining assumptions about, but now we're speaking them, or we're acting on them. And that term is microaggressions. Now, there's been a lot of talk lately about the term microaggressions, because if you continue to experience a microaggression over and over again, it's actually abuse. It's no longer micro. But we're going to call it microaggressions throughout this presentation. The problem with microaggressions, other than that they are hurtful and just downright wrong, is that they express a stereotyping or prejudiced attitude towards a member of a marginalized group. I'm taking you back to the social identity. Not only does it reinforce those stereotypes, you target that person's identity, you target that social identity, you target that person's social identity group. And it's usually those social identity groups that have traditionally been discriminated against. So in the 1970s, microaggressions were used to describe the experiences of Black people. It was in 2007 with Dr. Sue that it was extended to all groups that may have been discriminated against. It's that constant reminder that you are less than. It's the constant reminder that you are not equal. It's that attack on the aspect of your identity that you can't easily change. And it can harm several aspects of that person's identity at once. The harm is expressed as anger that a person feels, shame, annoyance, pity, and regular exposure starts to have impact on your mental health. It starts to have, people of color start to be isolated or invalidated for their experiences. And yes, they hurt. They hurt on so many levels, because people of color, Black people, have to stay hypervigilant because they're so quick and because they're so subtle. You are constantly hypervigilant on where is the next one going to come from. And they hurt, and they are hard to identify because they are hard to see. A lot of times they are part of everyday conversation, all because of what we have in our head, all because of what that event was that caused that bias. We talk about them, or we do the action as part of normal everyday conversation, everyday actions. And that's why they are so hard to identify, because they almost become the norm. This is one of the ones, as I was speaking to students, that they were so happy to have a name attached to it, because they did not know what to call it that they were experiencing. And that was a shock for me, that in this day and age, we still have students who are experiencing these microaggressions. But this is the history of them. This is what they cause. Again, it's reinforcing, or that constant reminder that you are less than and you're not equal. So how do you know if you've experienced one? So with a microaggression, it is defined by the person or the people who experience them, not the person who says them. So in this impact, it trumps intention. So you may not have intended to hurt someone, you may not have intended to cause anger, but the impact was there. So if you've ever been left questioning or thinking, did they just say that? Did that just happen? Well, why did that come up? Did I hear it wrong? You're unsure if you should bring it up. You think about the experience for a long time after it happened. You're unsure if you're making too much about the experience, or you're pretty sure the person making the slight would not have said the same thing to a person of a non-marginalized group or identity. You more than likely have experienced a microaggression. Microaggressions, we have some examples. So these are some common examples. Again, they come up in everyday conversation or everyday actions. Saying to a Black person, you are so articulate. That message is saying, because of your identity, you are not expected to speak correctly or as grammatically correct as other races. It's basically conveying the message, I am surprised because I thought my bias is telling me that you are less than. So I'm pretty surprised. You are a credit to your race, same thing. People of color are generally not as intelligent as white people, is the message that it's conveying. I'm not a racist. I have a lot of Black friends. That's conveying the message that people with friends of colors can't be racist. It's also saying that you're not acknowledging that the true definition of racism. So you may not be engaging in racist activities, but remember the definition of racism is that system of advantage based on race, systemic racism, the overarching, wide-ranging policies that we have in place. As a woman, I know what you go through as a racial minority. That's equating racial oppression with gender oppression, and in a way saying I can't be racist because I'm just like you. While gender oppression is very wrong, it's not the same as racial oppression. And so trying to equate the two does kind of minimize and invalidate the impact or the experiences of a member of a racial minority. Actions include grabbing a purse when a Black man walks by. That message is saying you are a threat and will steal from me. And purposely mentioning the race of a person when it isn't needed. That triggers the biases in others in regards to that race. We saw that this summer. We saw that with George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin when calling the police and stating it was a Black man. The bird watching story in Central Park, the woman calling the police and purposely stating that it was a Black man who wasn't even bothering her, but stating it was a Black man to trigger the biases in others to get an action. Those are all microaggressions. That was probably more so a micro assault, but those are all microaggressions, trying to bring up those things that are not needed, and in those little comments, those little actions that seem minor, but have lasting impacts and are built and based upon not only our history, but also the unconscious biases. Microaggressions hold the system of racism together. Because if we actually took the time to say, wait a second, no, this can't be true. I'm not gonna say this about a person because this isn't true. We would actually have empathy. We would actually see that, you know, there's no reason to say this because I wouldn't say this to another race or another marginalized group. They normalize, because they are in our everyday conversation, they normalize racism. Then they make racist assumptions about everyday life. Really, there's no reason to ever tell someone you are so articulate. But they normalize it, right? Microaggressions normalize this racist behavior and this racist view of, I really thought you were less than and weren't gonna come, you know, step into place. So I'm really confused now. So I'm gonna say it. And it's a slight. It's such a slight. It also damages any forward movement. If you think about, if you hold the notion that Black people are angry, then and questioning the Black person when they actually have an actual grievance, that's minimized because you go back to they're just angry, right? So it actually prevents a lot of movement forward because we go back to these microaggressions, we say these things, and they're rooted in the behavior of unconscious bias, again, that we're probably not aware of, or probably weren't even aware we were saying these things in normal conversation. So I want you to take a look at, or think about some other microaggression examples. Some that I didn't put on the slide is speaking loudly because you think a person doesn't understand English, right? Like, why do people do that, right? That's a microaggression. So again, reiterating that you don't belong, they keep you off balance. As a person who has experienced many microaggressions, they do keep you off balance. They keep you off balance, and it's a constant reminder and the psychological hurt of you don't belong. And so how do we get past this? So what do you do when you see, experience, or hear one? First, you need to question it. You need to say, hey, you know what, could you say that again? I'm not sure I heard you correctly the first time. Echo a person who says that, who questions it. Say, you know what, I agree. Don't ever say that around me or do that around me again. This is gonna take courage, y'all. Interrupt. Say, that is not okay to say or do around here. You know, and the experience, you know, the reaction you get from saying that to someone, it may not be pleasant. Trust me, it will not be pleasant, but you need to speak up. And this is all part of the education and awareness piece of it. And then educate. You might not know this, but saying that actually puts down Black people. I'm hoping today from this call, you're taking away some of the examples, some of the ways to handle all of this. So you'll know what to do next time you hear it. Because again, these are hard to see, hard to hear, hard to identify because they are such a part of everyday life. So definitely using these techniques to dismantle them, because when you call them out, you slowly start to dismantle the system of racism, which is our goal. How else can you do this? So we talked about our history. We talked about our behaviors, behaviors we may not have even known we had before now. But what else can you do? I'm a big fan of the education piece. We talked about social identities. So learn about those social identities that are different, but learn about them on your own. This isn't the time to go ask all your Black friends about, tell me about your social identity. So you're gonna need to do some learning on your own. Don't ask the intrusive questions. I think in this, especially these last 5 months or so, with our eagerness to learn, we want to ask experiences and how is this working, and tell me about what it's like to live as a Black woman. It's pretty intrusive, so don't do that. Learn about those identities on your own. There's a lot of books and readings out there that you can do, and documentaries. Surround yourself with diverse people, and this is not just to collect diverse friends. This is you creating space for casual conversation to build that rapport. So you then can start to maybe ask some non-intrusive questions and go ahead and admit limited knowledge. And this goes for everyone. I'm not just singling out one race of people. This goes for everyone. Be aware of the voice in your head. Question the assumption. Be open when someone questions that assumption for you, especially if it's a microaggression or an overt act. Unconscious biases are a little harder for someone else to question, but it'll show in your actions. Like I mentioned with not moving resumes forward based on a name. Question that assumption. Why are you not interviewing a candidate? Why do you have this preconceived notion that this particular student may not be good in this particular subject? Question that. And then learn by being committed to personal action. So it's not enough just to be educated. We still got to dismantle the systemic racism. So act on those learnings. You now know something a little different about some of the social identities. You now know a little bit more, I hope, about the history of the United States and some of the laws that were in place that led to some of the majority of a lot of our biases. You now know when those biases are acted out, what they're called. So let's act on those. Let's act on those in a good way of calling out the aggressions, calling out the unconscious biases, questioning them, questioning policies. That's how we move forward. I want to end with a little bit about non-racist versus anti-racist. I hear this a lot, what's the difference? So what I always like to say is, first, there's a great book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Dr. Ibram Kendi, that explains all of this. So I'm just gonna summarize. But it starts with remembering the definitions of racism and racist. Non-racist is a nice adjective, can be used as a noun. Anti-racist is a verb. So remembering the definition of what is racism, that system of advantage based on race. So the biggest thing that the worst thing you can do is to not acknowledge that complacency actually furders and perpetuates systemic racism. So you may not be engaging in the racist behaviors and the racist actions, and you very well may be a non-racist, and that's awesome. But anti-racism is actually being active and actually questioning things, being comfortable, being uncomfortable, being uncomfortable with your questions, being uncomfortable making mistakes in what you do, because that's how we start to dismantle it. So complacency is huge. There's a lot of complacency when it comes to systemic racism. We need people to move into action and be anti-racist, and that takes all of us. That takes all races, all generations, all people to make that happen. Just stop saying I'm not racist, because it's not helpful. I'm gonna give you the benefit of the doubt that you're not racist. That's great. I want to see some action, right? And not everyone's going to be, this is a journey. we're not all going to be in the same place at the same time on these issues, and that's okay. It's okay. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to not know what to say. But now you have a little bit more education to put a name with something, to know that, okay, this is, I felt weird about this, but this is what it's called. How can I act on that? Again, be comfortable with being uncomfortable. This is some work. We've got to work on it. It's so embedded. We talked about that with the laws and policies and with our own biases. It is so embedded. So it's going to take work, but don't give up. Don't give up. Keep fighting, keep questioning, and know that the response you get may not be the one you wanted, but you can continue to keep fighting and to keep questioning and to keep having action, keep educating yourself. And lastly, passive versus active. Again, non-racist is the passive, almost a passive view. So you're not engaging in the behavior, but you're not doing anything necessarily to confront or dismantle the racist behavior. There's a book called Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together in the Cafeteria? And the non-racist versus anti-racist view is described as in an airport, you're on when we could travel, you're on the passenger walkway, the conveyor belt that kind of moves you along as a passenger. The racists are the ones who are running, keeping the belt going. A non-racist is the person who's just riding it. We'll get to the destination, just riding it on their phone, maybe not looking at the person running past them, not the runner, not contributing to anything, but just going with the flow. Activism, or being active and anti-racist, is the person running in the opposite direction, doing all they can to stop that conveyor belt from continuing to go forward. So actively running, actively stopping it, questioning the person running the other direction, which one would say is the correct direction, but is it? Questioning why you're doing that. That's the difference between a non-racist and an anti-racist. And so I just want to conclude with one of my favorite quotes from James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And so what's next for you in your personal action plan? It's to come up with a personal action plan. How do you fight this? And you may be like, you know what, I'm tapping out, that's fine. But that's your action plan, that's your action plan. Continue the education and have these courageous, honest conversations. I am so excited that Oxley College of Health Sciences is having these monthly discussions to open up what I hope is courageous, honest conversations, to ask those questions in a safe space, to aid in the education piece of that will help you to hopefully develop your own personal action plan in this work. And so with that, Dean Ploger, I'm going to hand it back to you for the questions, because I think I can see those, but I think we're going to do a little moderating here. And so happy to turn it back over to you.
Well, we don't have any questions yet. Hopefully some will come in. I've gotten a couple of comments on my cell phone just about how good the presentation is. They're not showing up on Zoom, but thank you for your comments. This has been very helpful. And as you were talking, I was sitting here thinking about my personal, I wasn't framing it in the term personal action plan and continuing the conversation, but those were the thoughts that were going through my mind of what are my next steps for things that I need to do, both in my personal life, but also in my professional life, of how I can continue with these, the actions that I need to take. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much. At any time, if anyone has questions or, I'm happy to share the slide deck. It's not any kind of proprietary information. Feel free to reach out to me. If you are obviously at the University of Tulsa, I'm in the address book, Leonelle Thompson. Definitely reach out. Happy to share this presentation. Happy if you have a group need or anything, happy to share and work with you all as we continue this work. So thank you so much. Thank you, Dean Ploger. Thank you, Veronica for keeping everything going for us here in Zoom. I appreciate that.
Thank you. It was so good. This was very good. Well done,
Thank you.
Leonelle. Yes.
Thank you. Are there any questions? I saw something flash, but now I can't see it. So
there is a question. It says, is there such a thing as a person that is not racist at all, either towards a certain race or all races in general? Is it possible to achieve that?
I believe it is. Yeah, I believe it is. I think where we have to be careful is for a while, and I think it's a generation right after mine that was taught to be colorblind, or, there is no race. We need to be careful in saying things like that because, earlier when I mentioned like social identities, race is a social identity that we can't get around. And so it is possible to be not racist at all. I firmly believe there are people who do not have a racist bone in their body. Yes, I totally believe that. It's just be careful in our actions and how we say it. I think a lot of times we want to overly prove that we're not racist by saying things that there's one race, just the human race. And that's noble. It's just not true. Because these social identities have been assigned, race is a social construct, so we have to acknowledge that. But the way you act and to be described as non-racist, again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just not to be equated with anti-racist and dismantling the systemic racism. But I firmly do believe that you can be non-racist and not have any kind of racist thoughts against any particular race. It's just how we say it, and not saying I don't see color, I'm not colorblind, that kind of things, because that does minimize a person's social identity, which we want to get away from.
Thank you. There was another comment/question. Growing up in the DC area from 1974 through 1986, my social groups were inherently diverse. I find that all of my groups in Tulsa are generally homogenous. Suggestions to change this without being awkward or imposing, fill in the blank.
Yeah, so part of that is regional for sure, and part of that also comes with the bias. It's called affinity bias. We tend to want to be around people who are like us, and so it kind of goes back to my slide of starting to surround yourself with diverse friends. Everyone is different, and so I think when you approach it knowing that everyone's different, and you don't want to reach out to someone's like, hey, I don't have a Black friend, will you be my friend? That's not the way to approach that. But really starting to do the education piece and start to see where's the diversity that I want to be a part of, that I need to include in my friend group. So that may be joining a totally different group. And remember that diversity we focus a lot on it at surface level. Think about the things underneath the surface. That could be different hobbies. That could be, maybe you are a parent and you actually, want to surround yourself with people who are not parents. So joining different groups of that nature, and so really it takes work, but you have to be intentional about it. And so if you are awkward, part of that growth is being comfortable, being uncomfortable. And so again, what you don't want to do is just start collecting diverse friends just so you can say that you have diverse friends. But, seeking out those opportunities. Maybe it's going, after, hopefully when COVID's over, going to different restaurants, different museums, people at work. We established employee networks here at the University of Tulsa. So joining a network that actually may not align with something that describes you, but you just want to find more about, which is what one of our goals is, that people can actually be in cross networks to help to diversify their friend or colleague group.
Another comment was, thank you for the tips, and especially the analogy to airport travel. That hit home with one particular listener and myself as well. That was good.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. Again, I'm available for questions. I will not see them as intrusive. So definitely reach out. Tons of resources out there. Know that it can be overwhelming with all the resources. If I had to recommend some, I would start with the documentary 13th. And I would also start with the book, either How to Be an Anti-Racist or So You Want to Talk About Race. Just so it's just because it can be overwhelming with everything. So I know we're doing a book read at the University of Tulsa on Between the World and Me. I believe that's next week. So that's another great source to have. And shout out to, and I hope I'm really not speaking out of turn here, and I think I got it right. Our library is doing very well in diversifying our collection of books and who we purchase from. I know Terry has mentioned that to me. I don't know, Terry, if you're on the call, but and I cannot remember the person's name, forgive me, at McFarland Library, who's taken the lead on that to diversify how we procure our books and information and where from. So I'm sure our library has a copy that you can check out, keep in accordance with all of our social distancing guidelines.
And there was a comment that said the authors of those texts that you recommended are on social media, and she recommends that we follow them on social media.
Definitely, absolutely.
And Leonelle, I know that you've recently spoken to at least one class on campus, as well as maybe coaches in the athletic department. Were
Yes.
there other topics that you covered with them that you didn't discuss with us today that might be helpful for us to know, that you can speak on those topics, as those might be things that we would want you to share with classes or other groups we're involved with?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I didn't cover today was just general definitions on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that sense of belonging. And so happy to discuss those. Depending on the audience, definitely if there's students involved, the examples are a little bit more pertain to students versus, like athletics and coaching or the president's leadership team. But going through diversity, equity, and inclusion, discussing even more in depth microaggressions and unconscious biases, making the business case for diversity. So how do you create a diverse team? So tons of topics that we didn't scratch the surface with today, but are in the portfolio, if you will, or just leading a conversation. I've led book clubs, not for on campus, but book club sounds very formal. Discussions on the book White Fragility, and study guides and things of that nature. So yeah, happy to help where I can.
Awesome. The wheels are turning in my head of if you get a message from me or a phone call you might not want to answer.
Well, I thank you again for this opportunity and for what you're doing in the monthly series. I absolutely love it.
Well, thank you. Well, I don't see any other questions coming in, and we are close to our 2 o'clock time. So once again, Leonelle, I just want to say thank you so much. This has been very helpful, a great presentation. I think you're able to see the positive comments that have come in on the chat that you're able to see. So thank you again. And for those on the call, thank you for taking the time to join us today. And we look forward to seeing you the first Friday in November for our next meeting. And have a good day and a good weekend.
Bye, everyone. Stay safe.
Bye.